Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and the two black bins that you see dead ahead, there are a couple trays running European night crawlers, and the one on the left is 77 days old now, it's 11 weeks, and the one next to it is 53 days of age. And it's been 10 days since we last checked in on them. They were given pumpkin and banana peels. I don't know, it was the kind of feeding that I didn't expect to last very long, so I figured after 10 days they might be due for another feeding. So I've got an assortment of things here in this little plastic tub. Like, for example, this is mushroom, this is carrot peel, I've got a number of watermelon rinds, and an assortment of other things, berries, celery, cucumber bits, you name it. So I'm gonna get these trays up onto the bench one at a time, so we can get them fed. So let's get to work. We're beginning with the 77-day-old system. I just usually grab the older of the two bins when I'm feeding two bins at a time, or in general I usually just start with the older systems and work my way to the younger systems. That huge bulge on this worm. Sometimes I wonder if a really large bulge like that on the clitellum indicates that they might be looking to deposit a cocoon soon. And I don't know, that worm to me does not look like a European nightcrawler. To me that looks like maybe an Indian blue worm that snuck into here. And it was funny, I was watching a video yesterday, another worm channel, where the hostess, she was explaining how she had taken worms from her wormery and sent them to an expert for identification purposes. And she sent them all the way up to Canada to some guy who's a real expert when it comes to worms. And even though she thought she had a variety of different worm types, every worm that she sent was identified as a red wiggler. So you could tell in her voice she was a little bit upset about the fact that, she thought she was, I guess she's marketing the worms and trying to sell them and everything else like that. So I guess she was just a little bit upset that she was unable to really, I guess, deliver on what she thought she was able to deliver on. I think she was really interested in having European night crawlers, or maybe other worms, in her assortment, but it turns out that all she had was red wigglers. So when I think of the worms that I've got in my systems, I do wonder if, when, for example, a bin like this, when I think that I'm dealing with a bin of European night crawlers, am I really just dealing with a bunch of red wigglers? Who knows? I guess maybe the safest way to think of it is the way that you, I guess when you buy worms from certain retailers, they just refer to it as a red worm mix. So whatever type of worm happens to be in the mix is what you're getting. So now I was picking away here at a coffee filter that was draped out across the last feeding area, and showing us where we last fed. That's my so-called feeding zone indicator. I don't think I've got, no, I don't have any coffee filters on hand right now, so I got a feeling we're just going to reuse what's left of this feeding zone indicator and recycle it as bedding to go in with today's feeding. And this go around, I suppose we're just not going to have a feeding zone indicator. What is this, piece of potato maybe? One of my other bins, I've got potato actually growing. I unearthed some of this fairly crunchy potato. Usually the potato peels I put into my worm bins are not crunchy like that because I freeze them first, and then when they're thawing, they get all mushy and they're not really crunchy anymore. But I guess when you put raw potato in, I guess we put some raw potato in here too, the stuff has a tendency to start growing. So in my other bin I had like little tent city because the potato plants were growing. Looks like this piece of corn cob has a tail. Interesting, eh? Look at that. And look how thin that is. That is a piece of corn cob. And normally I don't really do anything with corn cobs. I just let the worms work it down. But sometimes I just can't seem to resist. My curiosity gets the best of me, so I want to just crack it open and see what's going on. More crunchy potato. Alright, enough chit chat. Let's get down into the feeding area, see how their last feeding is coming along. Those potato peels go back not to the last feeding, but a previous feeding, as does this piece of vegetable matter. It's good to see a worm or two hanging out on it. Perhaps it's finally going to get eaten. That too was a piece of vegetable matter that was not frozen. So those are the sort of things that are going to take a fairly long time to break down. It's the reason I adopted the practice of putting almost everything that I give my worms into the freezer before bringing it down here. Knowing that if I do that, it's going to, get all mushy and soft in the thawing process. And it'll just be so much easier for the worms to actually finally just rip right into it rather than needing to wait for the stuff to actually soften up on its own. So I'm pretty sure that these banana peels are part of the last feeding. And I think it was in this bin. The pumpkin that was put in actually included the stem of that particular pumpkin. So I'm curious to see if I'm remembering correctly. Oh, these are some of those pastries we gave them. Doesn't seem like they're going very far. I think that might have also been part of the last feeding too. That's okay. Everything eventually goes. Certain things just go a little bit faster than others. So I was starting to assemble a little collection of leftovers here on the side. And every time I'm finding a potato peel, I just feel like I want to crack it in half. I don't know why. But luckily none of the potato peels in this system are growing. Unlike the other system that I checked the other day, where it was just kind of crazy to see how the potato was starting to just like produce tons of roots going in all directions and starting to grow. It had a number of little shoots actually popping out of the surface of the tray of the bedding material. So now here's a piece of pumpkin stem. I'm not sure if this would be the stem that actually had some pumpkin attached to it, because I think there was also just a piece of pumpkin stem, and this one doesn't seem like it's got that part that attaches to the actual pumpkin, so maybe we still have yet to bump into another possibly larger pumpkin stem in here. So here and there we did definitely bump into a couple nice crowded sections with lots of worms hanging out in them. Oh wow. I could certainly feel where a lot of the corn kernels that the worms are finally starting to rip into are starting to pop off the kernel, off the cob. This seems like the lower portion of it. It was like down like this. So perhaps the moisture, the drippings of it, caused a lot of moisture down here to collect, and that's where the worms are kind of going at this piece of corn cob. I believe this piece of corn cob probably goes back a couple feedings too, so some of these, food items in here go back quite a ways. And it's the reason I feel like I should just come back in periodically to, feed my bins on a fairly regular basis, even if I know there's still stuff left over in the bins from previous feedings, because a lot of these feedings consist of materials that take a really long time for the, for the worms to get into. Or maybe there's stuff that the worms just can't even really make much use of right off the bat. Those little pastries, I was questioning whether they would like them or not, but it seems like they don't like them that much. But everything will eventually get to the point where, the bacteria and the microbes and everything will infiltrate it and get it to the point where the worms can also finally start ripping into the stuff. So, here too, a piece of vegetable that goes back who knows how far in time. So now I think I finally did bump into the stem that had a whole bunch of pumpkin still attached to it. And I believe here we've actually got a piece of the pumpkin, which the worms are certainly enjoying. And the stem is just one of those things that's going to take a while. I think we even took my little knife and we chipped off a piece of this stem just so we could be fair, and we gave a piece of that stem to the other system we're going to feed next. Alright, here's another little chunk of pumpkin down here. It does seem like there's a fair bit of leftovers remaining in this system. And most of the leftovers, like the corn cob and the pastry or the pumpkin stems, a lot of these things are things that are just going to be in the bin for quite some time. Potato peels. So I don't feel bad coming in to give them stuff like a bunch of mushroom or a bunch of carrot peels, because those are the sort of things, especially since they were all frozen, those are the sort of things they're going to be able to rip right into and eat right away. And then they'll return to working on whatever they can out of those slow composting materials. So even though you might be thinking to yourself, geez, why is he feeding? There's just so much food in there already. I guess the main reason is because I know that a lot of the stuff that's in there are just foods that are going to take a long time, and I wouldn't want to have the worms depending on stuff like that, since a large portion of it they simply can't eat yet. They'll be able to eventually in time. But in the meantime, I'm going to just give them other things that are going to be able to get eaten a lot more rapidly. And as time goes on and they're able to rip into some of those other slower composting foods, they will. But I would hate to leave them dependent on only that sort of stuff, since it would just be sitting there and they wouldn't be able to eat it. So I think it's a good way to go. Alright, so I've opened up a pretty good size hole here. I've got my collection of leaves that I bought down here, which we're going to use as the foundation for today's feeding, the bedding for today's feeding. And it did seem to me like there's a good bit of moisture in here. So kind of like the idea of putting in some fairly dry bedding. Now let's see, I wanted to be able to split this pile of carrot peels evenly, so I can leave half of it for the other system we're going to be feeding next. So it does seem like it's permitting me to chip off gradually some of the carrot peel, and it seems to me like this is probably about half, so let's save half of that for the next system. And then here too, I wanted to share the mushroom. So luckily I was able to just break the entire block in half pretty easily, and the rest of it is also such that I can break apart pretty easily with my hands. And let's see, if I remember correctly, there was like 6 pieces of watermelon rind that I picked out of another bag to include with this assortment here. So by giving this bin 3 and saving 3 for the next system, although I don't know where the other ones are now. Maybe it was just 4, so maybe I should hang on to one of them. Whatever. And then I'm just going to reach down into the bottom and grab a handful of this assorted other junk that's down here, hoping that we're divvying out the food supply pretty fairly so that both bins get an equal amount. And then, you know, before we pile all those leftovers back in on top of what we gave them fresh here, let's throw a little bit more bedding in. And I've also got my grit on hand, so let's sprinkle in a little bit of this pulverized eggshell to aid in their digestion. And if we yeah, we got enough here. If we hang on to a little bit of that too, we've got enough to go around for both bins. And now I guess we could begin returning some of this old food to the feeding area. I'd just like to be able to, ooh, those corn kernels are spraying at me as I press on it. So let's see, some of these pieces of cardboard here, I guess can go in as almost like a semi-top covering. Although I do want to cover everything up over here. But it does seem like these pieces of cardboard have a much greater chance of getting worked on if they're near the foods. Perhaps we would have even given them a better chance at getting worked on if we had placed it under the foods, but hindsight's always 20/20. At this point, it's just going to have to go in like that, and now we can begin trying to cover up the feeding zone. I'm going to pull out some material from this outer edge give us a chance to see how things out there look. Sometimes I wonder if the reason I'm not seeing a lot of worms on the outer edges is because they were all down where the foods were. I mean, I do see a few worms, so it's not like the material is treacherous or dangerous. So there's definitely worms hanging out in it. Although I can tell that it is a little bit drier than the material that was down in the feeding area. That's pretty much to be expected, I believe. So now let's start rolling some of this material over. I guess this is where a lot of the worms are that we excavated out of the feeding area. So I guess as we spread the material out, we get another little worm sighting. Oh, I guess there's some more banana peel here. I don't know. There's a good assortment of food in here. Kind of makes me wonder if perhaps I should place a little bit more time in between feedings for a system like this that's got so many leftovers in it. I don't know. I told you my philosophy on the leftovers, so I don't see any harm in coming back in here and continuing to give them foods that they can, you know, enjoy almost right away, leaving the slower stuff to eventually get eaten too, but not making them, you know, feel like they're depending on it. I don't know. Not that I think that they're going to feel that or sense that or believe that. Okay, very, very nice. It's interesting how light the material in here appears to be. Perhaps it's because I've been using a lot of shredded paper and cardboard in my bins as bedding. But that was so much fun. I don't know, I feel like I took a lot of time checking in on this system, so I'm going to see what I could do about possibly picking up the pace a little bit so we can get the other bin fed, but without taking up an exorbitant amount of time to get the job done. These pieces of cardboard too, you know, I should probably just include them down in the feeding area as bedding too, so that they can possibly get broken down too, because sitting out here on the top surface they don't really seem to get a whole lot of attention. So I don't know, I might have to make a few notes to myself to come up with some sort of a slightly better strategy for these systems. But I think we can get this one here covered back up so we can head on over to the other bin and get them fed too. Yeah, all this newspaper too. Seems almost unnecessary to have quite so much newspaper out on top. That too would probably serve well as bedding for the next feeding. Maybe instead of bringing in leaves or some sort of outside bedding material, we can, you know, use the next feeding as an opportunity to use up some of those top covering materials as bedding and kind of fold them down into the feeding area so they can get some better attention than what they're getting. All right, let's get the other system out here. So this one is about, what, 2.5 weeks or 3.5 weeks? A couple weeks younger than the other bin that we just fed. If memory serves me correctly, I think we have an estimated population in here that's just slightly larger, perhaps by maybe 50 or so worms. I don't know. Sometimes I don't even pay that much attention to the worm count estimates. So I guess they're kind of interesting in the beginning, but once you get the worms situated into a new space, and assuming that they feel pretty comfortable in that space, they probably begin breeding and, you know, multiplying, and then who knows what becomes of the numbers. So, and actually in the other system was actually launched off with the material that came out of some buckets that were set up for the purposes of breeding. So in that system, I've actually been expecting to see baby worms beginning to just sort of pop up and maybe an explosion to the population in there. Whether or not I've actually been seeing that, I don't know. But that was how we arrived at that particular population. Here we just had a bin that we built, loaded some worms into it, and this one got off to a somewhat more conventional start. So I guess last time we sort of explored the outreaches of the bin at the end. This time I was just sort of curious to see how things are on the outskirts, so I went for the outer edge over here first. And that's fine. There's no real set way to check your worm bins. You just follow follow your interest, or you follow your curiosity, I guess. So not that many worms. I mean, yeah, there's worms everywhere in varying numbers. But my guess here too is that once we get down into the feeding area, that's where we're going to see a good number of worms hanging out. So let's just start piling some of this material. It's covering up the feeding zone off on the side. And we'll have stuff that we can cover up with at the end. And then we can get down into seeing how they're doing on their last feeding. Here too, I can see we gave them banana peel. And here's, I think this was that chunk of the pumpkin stem that I chipped off of the other system's pumpkin stem, so we can share pumpkin stem material. And then we've got little bits of cardboard. Yeah, there's some similarities between these systems. And maybe here we can use hindsight as something to help us. Maybe here we can actually do what we talked about in the other bin, which is to actually give these pieces of cardboard over here a slightly better chance at getting broken down by putting them down lower, perhaps below the foods, rather than on top of the foods. So here too, we've got very similar types of vegetables that have been here in the bins for quite some time. This piece actually feels pretty soft. So it's getting, and there's a whole bunch of worms in it, so it seems like they're doing pretty good on that particular piece of vegetable matter, whereas in the other system, they're not really able to make, or haven't so far been able to make much use of it. And, what is this? Oh, another piece of this similar, that tough vegetable, but this one's really getting some attention from the worms, which is nice to see. Oh, let's not let this little guy slip out of the bin. So yeah, here and there, there's good sized piles of worms ripping into the foods that they got last time. Kind of makes me wonder why, you know, one system appears to, you know, be able to rip into certain food types so much easier than another bin. Here too is a piece of that vegetable matter. This piece also feels a little bit dry and perhaps slow starting. What else we got here? There's all kinds of stuff. Oh, another good sized piece of pumpkin stem. It's always so interesting how the worms really do seem to enjoy pumpkin stem for some reason. I mean, look at that guy right there. Seems to have found himself a little hole and he's like burrowing straight into it, even down here. You wouldn't think that they'd be all that interested in it because it's just like a lump of wood basically, but I guess there's something to it that they like. So like this bin here, I got pieces like this, little chunks of corn cob. Here's another one. So rather than, since I didn't have two pieces with the kernels on it, I used an assortment of these chopped up pieces of corn cob to give this bin. To try to keep things kind of fair and equal. But I only had one that had the corn kernels on it, and that one went to the other system. So here too, pretty good size pile of worms. Kind of making me wonder, are they down there because of some of the food that we gave them? Or is it just because the moisture in the system tends to drop to the bottom and they're going for the moisture? I don't know. It is a pretty busy bin. It was kind of nice to find a whole bunch of worms hanging out down in the feeding area, because when we checked the outskirts, we didn't see a whole lot going on. Here's another piece of that seemingly slow vegetable matter, which in this bin seems to be doing a little bit better than the other bin. So, I don't know. There's always going to be some differences, some commonalities, but I think we're at the point now that we can go ahead and reset this system's feeding area. We're going to go ahead and give these guys a nice little portion of fresh leaves too, out of my leaf box. Oops. That's about an equal amount. But let's do what we talked about earlier. Let's bring in these pieces of cardboard and put them right in the line of fire. Any sort of juices that might drip out of these frozen foods that we're adding, they're going to drip right onto these pieces of cardboard. However, I don't want to block the leaves underneath from getting some moisture too, because they went in dry. So maybe I can just leave some gaps between the cardboard bits here and the leaves underneath. And then we can start bringing in the foods. Here's the mushroom. Here's the carrot peel. I guess the stuff's thawing out. It's making it just making it so much easier to break it apart now that it's softened up a little bit from thawing. And let's just drop in what remains. Here's one, here's two. So for some reason I thought I had bought 6 pieces of watermelon rind, but it seems that I bought 4, so giving 2 to each system seems like the way to go. Alright, a little bit of grit, and you know, what the heck, let's just give them what remains of this and I'll have to replenish. And then I think what we did before too was we gave even more leafy material on top of the fresh foods, and then in came the leftovers. And there are quite a bit of leftovers. So let's roll them back down into the feeding area. Interesting. A couple of interesting bins. And I think we've left ourselves a pretty good bit of stuff out here on the edges with which we can cover up with and also have a nice level surface. So let's do just that. Kind of spreading it all around here and there. There are bits of food, little pieces of potato peel here and there. Here I somehow didn't feel as compelled to snap potato peels in half. I guess I got distracted by the worms. Very nice. I've been trying to be pretty generous with the bedding and all my feedings, so it does feel like our system is starting to increase in size somewhat. And alright, here's a coffee filter with which we're marking the feeding area. Unfortunately, we didn't have one to put into the other system. Actually, I do have them. They're over on the shelf, but I didn't think that, for some reason, since there wasn't one, or at least there was one, but it got so beaten up and eaten up already that I figured we'd find one in a similar state here, but this one seems like it must have been put in much more recently. That's okay. Perhaps next time we'll come in with coffee and some filters and make sure that we give the other one a coffee filter too. Alright. Fun bins, you know, there's I guess there's always that uncertainty though, you know. I do wonder if I've actually got European night crawlers in here. I know that it's not pure night crawlers, so I'm almost certain what I saw in the beginning was a Indian blue worm. Can't even remember now. Was it in the beginning of this system or was it in the start of checking the other system? But I did definitely see, you know, one worm that seemed to have those sort of banded tiger stripes that I think are an indication of a European night crawler. But you know, I don't know. There is a fair bit of uncertainty when it comes to worms, and I've never been one that can really, you know, look at one and clearly identify it easily. So I don't know. I'm not going to go to the trouble of sending my worms to have them identified by a professional. I'm just going to trust that, you know, what I think I've got is what I've got, or at least I'm just going to keep calling them that. That's good enough for me. All right, everyone. I've got some cleaning up to take care of and a few things to put away. But before I go take care of those things, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up. That's always very much appreciated. If you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.